Chapter 17. My mind reeled. Memory eradicator? What does that do? He spoke more quickly. He used to use it on his adversaries. It locks by X-ray to the portions of the brain related to memory and transmits disturbing electrical impulses. The impulses displace stored images and cause the subject to confuse short and long-term memories. It works over a period of time to... I couldn't listen to any more. I clapped my hand over my mouth to stifle a scream, feeling like I was going to be sick. August jerked his shoulders back. The process is reversible up to a certain point. My dad said 20 hours. That's until he goes insane. After that, if he's not taken care of in another 24, he'll die. It all came together in my head. That's what happened to Dr. Holmes. Who? I grabbed his arm. When Crash came, he said that he'd talked to Dr. Holmes on Earth and he was barely lucid. He died the next day. He told Crash to warn the doctor. You mean Dad used it to get this doctor to tell him where you were? I nodded. He must have. And then, I thought quickly, mind clearing and beginning to race. When Crash heard about 2 scientists leaving Earth, he thought that was the threat. They were chasing after Commander Howitt's father, trying to get to the Radialloy before he did. The what? He looked utterly lost. He must not have heard about the Radialloy. Do you think he really means he'll let the doctor go insane if we don't reach your speeder in time? August's face grew angry. Not only that, but I don't believe he'll stop it even if we do get there in time. August, we have to save him. You have to stop it. I can't, he cried back. Even if I knew how, I couldn't get to the machine. He has it locked in his quarters. My mind kept racing, grasping after a solution. There had to be one. There had to be one somewhere. We have to contact Crash and Wales and get them to help. But how? There's no way to transmit. He's taken communications offline. Maybe we can get it back or divert power from something else. He'd be sure to notice. Don't underestimate him, Andi. I backed up a step, angry. I'm not just going to stand here and do nothing. There has to be a way. Before he could respond, a voice from the door startled us. Lieutenant Howitz, your father orders you to return to the bridge immediately. We're making the warp jump. August looked down at me, features dragged down with sorrow. I wish I could help you, but I can't. Hot tears stung my eyes, overflowing, draining the hope out of me. I looked at him pleadingly, but he turned and followed the officer out. I wanted to drop to the cot and cry again, but just as they left the room, Mr. Jarvis came back in with Mr. Yannendale. I didn't know what had delayed him, and I didn't want to. I just needed to focus on my work right now. Taking a breath so deep I could feel the oxygen spreading to every cell, I approached the cot where he lay, his narrow face chalky and pained. Mr. Jarvis looked sternly at me. He is to be taken to the brig as soon as you have finished treating him, the officer said brusquely, then seated himself watchfully on the other side of the room. Blood covered the patient's left shoulder, staining his uniform. So the blast hadn't hit his chest, as I first thought. Still, it was a nasty wound, and they'd taken their own sweet time in getting him down here. The hole in his jacket was charred around the edges, indicative of blaster fire. I steeled myself. I'd dealt with things like this before and hadn't been bothered. It was just that my nerves had been worn nearly raw by the events of the day. Carefully, gently, I pried the jacket away from the wound and slid the sleeve off his arm. Did you manage to send a message? I whispered hopefully. In the same cautious tone, he replied, I don't think so. I pushed the button when he wasn't looking, but nothing happened. I think communications had already been taken offline. He moaned as I pulled his shirt away from the bloody wound. How bad is it? He asked faintly. I sighed. Some blood loss and muscle damage. I can repair it, but you'll need to wear the arm in a sling for a while to minimize movement until it finishes healing. And it will be sore for quite a while. I pressed a pad of sterile dressing to the wound to slow the bleeding while I got the regen ready. After I'd finished repairing the wound, I carefully sat him up and slung the arm close to his chest, adjusting the strap so that it wouldn't move too much. When I had at last finished, I looked at him. He looked back and tried to smile. "He said you have to go to the brig." "I know." With a glance at his pale face, I beckoned to the guard, who sat sternly in the corner, to indicate that he could take the patient away now. With little ceremony, he escorted Mr. Yanadel from the room. Exhausted, I sank into a chair in the corner closest to the door. My mind was too tired to think anymore. I had to rest for a few minutes. Why? Why was my father so intent on having the Radialloy? And how? How had he found me? First, I sorted out the stories I'd been told by him and by Pete and Sigmund. I decided to believe his story of what the Radialloy was, since he'd proved that I did have Langham's disease. The only part I discarded, for the moment anyway, was the idea that there was another cure. I no longer believed that he wanted to save me. Then I put Crash's story together with August's and came up with an imperfect idea of what had happened in the past. My mother had taken me to the doctor, dying before she could return home. Perhaps my father had planned to take the Radialloy away from me, to sell it, and she had wanted to save me. This didn't make total sense, but I accepted it for the moment. Several years later, after I'd been raised by the doctor and gone to space, my father had for some reason decided he needed to find the Radialloy again. Possibly he'd gotten in trouble with someone and needed the money or the Radialloy itself to get out of it. Perhaps he'd worked with Pete and Sigmund and they needed it. Or maybe their supervisor did and he'd sent them after it. They must be the two scientists, Leek and his assistant Mars, that Crash had mentioned. Regardless, my father had picked up August and come after me, after tracking me to Grand Forks, seeking out the doctor's closest friend, Dr. Holmes, and finding out from him that we'd gone to space. One thing still didn't make any sense at all. How? How had he tracked me here? Impulsively, I stood up and walked over to where I'd left the CMR scanner the night before. What if this whole thing was a mistake and I didn't really have the Radialloy after all? It was high time I made sure. Seating myself on one of the cots, I plugged the scanner into the adjacent monitor and turned it on. I hesitated for one moment. The doctor had said never to use it on myself because the magnet could pull at my implant, but I'd just use it for a second. Not allowing myself time to think more about it, I pulled my skirt above my legging-clad right knee, set the scanner to one point, and moved it above my leg. For an instant, my mind focused on the image displayed on the monitor. The patella was visible, but was most definitely not all bone. That was evident at a glance. There was metal in the middle of it, just as the doctor had told me, though the scanner couldn't identify what kind. Then it was true. Scarcely had I taken all this in when my knee grew suddenly hot. The heat intensified rapidly, and a familiar spasm shot through my knee. With a cry of pain, I had the presence of mind to shut the scanner off. The pain dropped almost as rapidly as it had arisen, again leaving a numb, warm throbbing.